Yes, this is interesting. Of a lifelong trip that has finally found me an ecology of knowledge that is relevant to what we are talking about.
And I have observed in my own Pakistani context, for example, we have 70 plus languages.
Yes.
And people really, they think that these 70 languages have their own linguistic boundaries.
Yes, is that the centerpiece of expertise in linguistics is the speaker.
Language purity is a real phenomenon because people think that you cannot even mix our code switch or code mix and bring the words from other languages to it.
Pakistan have shaped British and to some extent American scholarship.
Professor Sinfree, thank you very much for your time to speak about rethinking applied linguistics in the global south. Since you come from Zimbabwe, a country in Africa which has been an ex-British colony, could you, how do you recall your colonial experiences and memories in your own country and connect it with your current academic scholarship in the Southern theory and decolonial?
Yes, thank you very much for the opportunity to reflect on my career, my life, and the direction and unexpected paths it has taken. I grew up in Zimbabwe, and I went to a missionary school in the eastern part of Zimbabwe. The school is called St. Augustine's. And my earliest recollection of language issues in that school can be captured as follows. It was not, the problems I encountered were not problems of not being allowed to speak or write in my first language, which I thought, if we can call it first language, Shona, which is a Bantu language. That was never stopped. The problem I had was that I could never fully understand why I never could get good grades in my first language. But I could pass and get good grades in English. So from that early stage, I always wondered what the problem here was. If Shona was my first language, I said, why is it so problematic and so difficult to pass Shona? But it was relatively easy to pass and English. So I did at A level, I did English. I then went on to university to study English and linguistics, etc. Right. So that question was always lodged at the back of my mind.
Yeah.
And that is one aspect about my colonial experience that I've always been interested in trying to address.
Right.
I don't know if you want me, I can continue to then explain more about the impact of that colonial experience. I couldn't enroll at the University of Rhodesia then, which became the University of Zimbabwe, because during that year you needed to go and be part of the Rhodesian army, which was fighting against the Zimbabwean guerrillas if you were to be admitted to the university. So some of us left the country.
Right.
Yeah, right. And that marked the beginning of a lifelong trip that has finally found me at Penn State. And I then left Zimbabwe. This is where this is useful for applied linguistics and my interest in epistemology. when I was in Zimbabwe, the colonial experience was that the experts in any area that I was dealing with were all white. Right. The books that we read were largely written by white people. But when I went to the University of Ghana, that was the first time I encountered experts who were black.
Yeah.
So it was interesting to see the shift in thinking for me that, it's possible to have black expertise even in the world of academia.
Right.
Yeah.
So then, as a part of your academic career, why did you choose applied linguistics? So does it have anything to do with the colonial history and memories?
Yeah, this is the two things that happened. When I got into the University of Ghana, I did English literature, and then I also did applied linguistics and history. I was interested in linguistics because it provided me with some ability to analyze the social context of language around me. That is what I really liked about it. I wasn't drawn very much to the literature part, the literary part of English, because it looked like, this was just sort of colonial novels and Beowulf, Chaucer, Shakespeare. I wasn't drawn to that. So I drifted towards more language aspects of it. And I still had the curiosity of trying to explain to myself the problem I explained at the very beginning, why I could not pass my indigenous languages, but could pass English.
And you have been working in diverse areas, like discourses of terrorism,
yes,
and language in health in Africa, and language planning, language policy, philosophy of language. And recently you have also started working in the Southern theory and decolonial. So I want to know what constitutes the global South and Southern epistemologies according to you.
Okay, right. This is a good question. What constitutes Southern theories for me are ways of thinking.
Right.
They're ways of orienting towards a problem. They are forms of social and political struggle in scholarship.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a way of orienting towards a problem in which you are arguing that all these things are entangled, they are all interrelated in a way. So what Southern theories do is that they challenge the idea of they enable you to understand that there is a distinction between geography and epistemology. That epistemology is a way of thinking about a problem. So you could have a Southern epistemological view, even if you're in State College, you're in Philadelphia.
Right.
But you could have a global Northern view about the world, even if you're in Cape Town, in Pakistan, etc. Because it's your intellectual orientation towards what you are trying to do. So the interesting thing about Southern epistemologies that is becoming clear to me is that it has a number of approaches. There's no general simple consensus about what it is. Right. But you can say that the aim of Southern theories to address the challenges Western scholarship is faced outside Western context, and the challenges Western scholarship is faced with in the global north. So, in a way, Southern theories are global.
Right.
They are global in intent, but their globality, if one were to borrow Googie's term, is different from that of globalization of most northern theories. They are not imperialistic in their globality. They are consensus. That's the way to frame it. They are epistemologically founded on issues about consensus. So, the interesting thing about Southern theories then is that they then challenge issues about hierarchy, authorship, books, etc., and all the issues like that. So, for example, there is a book that we are working on which does, where there is no single author to it, there only is a group name.
Right.
Just a group name. This is who we are, and we come from all sorts of different places. That is where I think Southern theories are they're liberating.
Right.
They liberate you from the confines of current thinking. Yeah.
Right.
But they also are forward-looking in that they always are seeking to try and provide a better explanation to the circumstances but they are not imposing one way of handling all these issues. Yeah.
Yeah. And in many parts of the colonized world, including Pakistan, applied linguistics is heavily influenced by colonial knowledge and ideological structure. For example, we have like British and American linguistics, which is very dominant in Pakistani context and in several other South Asian and African contexts. So in that sense, what insights can we get from Southern theory and Southern epistemologies to rethink applied linguistics in the South?
Good. This is interesting. Southern theories, Southern context, Pakistan, Africa, etc., have shaped British and, to some extent, American scholarship more than American and British scholarship is willing to accept. What happens to most of these people, they get out into Pakistan, they get out into Africa, and then they all of a sudden realize that there is a disjuncture between what they thought was going to happen and what happens when they get to the African context. In other words, they realize that their theories are not functional within those contexts. Let me give you a group of sites for you, a group of British scholars, and then I'll get to the American. There is a generation of British applied linguists, all who somehow taught or some of their formative years in applied linguistics were spent in Africa. People like Alan Davis, people like Chris Bramfitt, people like Rod Ellis, etc., and all those people. Their first encounter, which showed them the limitations of their applied linguistics, was in context outside Britain. And when they then returned into the UK, they were trying to provide theories to explain their experiences outside. So in other words, there's always been a sense in which it was the margin that shaped the core of what constitutes applied linguistics. And of course, we were never given credit for that. But that was the case. That was always there. And there has been a lot of students, a lot of faculty members who then have gone to establish careers in the North, but they're coming from the South and they're moving on. I mean, Suresh, etc., and all people like that who will become very successful in the North. Largely because they've retained the global South experiences that enables them to see the world differently, even in the North.
And Jyväskylä, he talks about global ethics in terms of rhizomatic relationships, where he argues for collapsing of hierarchies, right? So as to view the relationship between languages, culture, literature in terms of the network. So in relation to global ethics, what do you think? How can we rethink applied linguistics in the South?
Okay, what it means that in terms of global ethics, what you want is not an applied linguistics that has got a hierarchy, let's say, of native speakers, non-native speakers, second language speakers, teachers, learners. No. You want an applied linguistics in which everybody's life is intermingled with other person. We try to do that in our recent project on unbooking, or even in the Global Virtual Forum, where it's a range of people who are bringing in different experiences to create an ecology of knowledge that is relevant to what we are talking about. The issue about collapsing hierarchies that is not, when you say you're trying to collapse hierarchies, you are not saying you don't acknowledge that people bring different experiences. That is not what you're saying. What you're saying is that in the experiences that people bring are all important, right? But you don't value them in terms of a hierarchy, because the hierarchy implies excluding other types of experiences, right? But that's not where you are going. That's not what you're going. What you are interested in is the intermingling, the mutual entanglement of experiences around the globe.
And in two of your co-authored books with Alastair Panico, Disinventing and Reconstituting Languages, and others, Innovation in Chinese and Applied Linguistics in the Global South, you talk about decolonizing language as an object of study in linguistics and applied linguistics, and propose reconstituting them. So how do you explain this, and how is this notion of disinvention and reconstitution of language informed by Southern theory?
Yes. Okay. The argument about disinvention arose from an intellectual awareness that the notion of language, what constitutes language, as it is framed in some cases as an object of analysis, etc., and all that, is itself a colonial enterprise, right? That it was a product of a specific institutional, global, political discourses that created these ideas about language. Right. We talk about that now in another paper where we talk about even the idea of water as H2O, etc. That the idea of water as an object running through the tap, and of thinking of water in that way is, in a way, is part of that invention. So, in other words, what we're now making, the connection we're making, that the invention of language is analogous to the invention of thinking about water as something that you get from a tap. Why we're arguing for disinventing language to some extent is because we are pointing out the imperial nature of the discourses of language, right? These people have never really begun to systematically realize that the problem in some of these cases that we're faced with may not be the issue about teaching, about language policy, etc., etc. It may lie in how we are thinking about that problem, right? So the problem might be how we are thinking about language. So in order to move beyond that, that's why we came up with the notion of of disinventing language. But then the interesting thing, this is linked to one of the questions that you posed, which is interesting, is that there is an interesting challenge here if you say to people, we need to disinvent language because it is problematic, and then you also have nationalistic movements, which are grounded in notions about language, then they will then begin to argue, oh, you are now saying there is no language in what we're doing. No, that's not what we're saying. What we are saying is this, is that you need to be aware of the discourses and the language ideologies that form the basis upon which you are constructing that idea about language. You may want to construct the idea of language in a particular way for your indigenous movement, but that way may be very different from the way somebody may want to construct language for language teaching purposes. All right. So that is what we are saying. We're not saying, oh, people should never be interested in framing and thinking and talking about language. We're simply drawing attention to the need for you to be aware of how your discourses may create language in a particular way that may make it difficult for you to accomplish your objectives. One. And then we also then say why it is necessary to disinvent languages is that we say that in some cases, language teaching is a very interesting example here. The tendency is to think of language teaching as if the object of language is a neutral one. As if you're just going to teach. But then that's not the argument. The argument we are making is language teaching entails shaping very specific ideological apparatus about language, particular views about language. And the example that I normally get is if you meet a young kid going to school and they speak Urdu, they speak Gujarati, they speak Shona, Swahili, etc. It's when they get to school and see these labels on their timetable that leads them to shift and adopt a radically different orientation towards language, because they'd never thought about it as an object that could be taught like geography or mathematics. They just thought of it as a form of communication. But once you have got it on a timetable, you are framing it in a very specific epistemological lens. Yeah.
And I have observed in my own Pakistani context, for example, we have 70 plus languages.
Yes.
And people really, they think that these 70 languages have their own linguistic boundaries.
Yes.
And therefore they try to preserve these languages.
Yes.
And bring like identity politics in relation to language.
Yes.
So how do you view this now?
Yes. You see, this is interesting. This is where this is very interesting. That the idea of these numbers of languages in this specific part, this is one very specific way of thinking about language. But the tendency is then to think about that way as the natural way of doing linguistics. What has happened there, that is the dominant way, the countability of language preservation. As we put it, for example, in our book on innovations and challenges to applied linguistics, the innovations, preservation, counting languages, those are very specific ways of viewing language. They are not the only way that you can view language. Some of the speakers of those languages don't think of them in terms of, how many speakers are there in my language who speak my language? No. Speakerdom is one way of thinking about language, but it's not the only way. And it might not necessarily be the most productive way of thinking about language in all contexts. But for government purposes, for governmentality purposes, for censuses, for administration, they may want to know how many people speak this language, how many people speak that language, because that's what governments do. They count, right? So in order for the counting to take place, they need to know the numbers of this. So whether it is numerically, epistemologically, the most productive way of going about linguistics is not counting them. But governments, because that is the dominant discourse that they have, they need to know how many people speak this. So you need to convert them into countable entities. But it is a sharp ideological process that you are engaged in when you eventually end up with those categories. And a lot of other discourses then arise like, oh, if you're going to count, if you're going to say there are 5 languages, then you will need boundaries between them. So you have to create a number of things. So another set of assumptions are set in motion because of that.
And then do you agree that language purity is a real phenomenon? Because people think that you cannot even mix the code switch or code mix and bring the words from other languages to it, because you affect the purity of language. So how do you view this purity?
Okay, good. There are 2 layers to it. The language purity is an ideological orientation towards language. Any language to some extent is combined with other languages. But whether you're going to say it's pure or not pure, it's your own ideological orientation towards the task that you have got. So, I agree that there are people who are concerned about language purity. But whether language purity exists or not depends on the power of the sociolinguistics microscope that you use. What do I mean? What I mean by this is, if you do a detailed sociolinguistic analysis of any language, you always will find that these things are mixed with other things.
Yeah.
Right. There's never a language that has got no influence or contact with another language. So it depends on how detailed is the analysis that you want to make. Right. That is what the point which I want to make. And when people are talking about language purity, it's not so much language that they are concerned about. They are concerned about something else. And language happens to be the instrument or the mobilizing tool, to be the entity around which they want to mobilize. Right. When they say, we need to keep when the French says, they need to keep French pure, etc., against the English, it's not so much French that they're concerned about. They are concerned about the hierarchical relationships between French and English. In other words, the discourses about language purity are never about language. They are about something else. But they are articulated via language. Yeah. That's the way I think about this. Yeah.
Right. In 2003, in more than 2 decades, you wrote about Black linguistics and Black scholars. So how do you explain it today after the 2 decades of this publication?
That was, I think, one of the most exciting projects I got involved in. What was happening there was an awareness that race operates in linguistics, but in ways that are not frequently discussed.
Right.
That non-white scholars may have interests in linguistics that are very different from those of white scholars. So we wrote Black linguistics. And then it led us to the conclusion that you can be able to characterize language in terms of race, Black languages, white languages, etc. For example, English, you could argue, is seen as largely a white language, in the sense that if you are white and you speak English, it is assumed you are proficient in it. But if you are Black and you speak English, you have to demonstrate that you are proficient in it, because the de facto position for English is white. Right. Even though there are many different varieties of English spoken everywhere, expertise and whiteness and English are interchangeable. So we then argued about the need for a strand of Black linguistics And I remember that that's where we have some of the early articles on disinvention, racial linguistics are found in there. It's a project that I regret I never pursued, but which has got revived, but in a different way now through the Global Southern framework. But it now characterized in terms of philosophical orientation towards language, rather than in terms of race. Mm-hmm. The issue which was there was scholarship at that point was more willing to accept that the race could be studied, language and race, etc., but was reluctant to accept that black scholars or non-white scholars may have different interests from other scholars. So it was, at that point, a dead end. But the introduction to that volume is really good. Mm. It really is good. I mean, talk about multilingualism, and the foreword was written by Ngugi wa Thiong'o in that volume. And it is really a very, very good argument that we were making, and it was ideologically much clearer than a lot of other subsequent arguments we have ever made. Today, for example, I was just talking with another colleague. We're finishing a book on Black linguists on Black languages, which is a follow-up to Black linguistics, but this it is based largely in Brazil.
But how do you see this, for example, the same Black linguistics, which is actually that comes in alternatively in the name of racial linguistic perspective, that becomes dominant, and Black linguistics seems to be marginalized. Now, for example, as a student of applied linguistics, I didn't know about Black linguistics as such, but I came across these white scholars and racial linguistics and all the dominant. So how is this epistemological racism?
Oh, it is what happened. This is interesting this is a very interesting point you're making. Ideas become dominant to some extent because of who articulates them. The irony of racial linguistics is that, particularly when you juxtapose it with Black linguistics, racial linguistics is racist in the sense that it never acknowledges the background, formation, and origins it has to Black linguistics. It erases that history. Right. It's only if you read the book by Alim on language and race. Alim acknowledges where these ideas came from. But a majority of the people just imagine that racial linguistics began with racial linguistics and Black linguistics. When they come across Black linguistics, which is 2 decades before this. It's 2 decades before this. They don't even aware that this is this. And it's also part of American imperial empire, where the only ideas that are circulated and acknowledged are the ones that are framed within the American establishment. Yeah, it's racial linguistics and Black linguistics is really an interesting paradox about it. It's also like the other paradox that is interesting is between translanguaging and disinventing. Ophelia, for example, has said in a couple of on presentations that without translanguaging, without disinventing, it would have been difficult for her to clearly articulate what translanguaging was. Right. So I get used to it. I don't compare. Yeah, it happens. It's only that you see the irony of it, and it touches on issues about citation, who cites who. It moves on issues about where they are located and all that. And yes.
And in your recent edited volume, you talk about integrational linguistics and the philosophy of language in the global south. And you discussed that integrationism, although grounded in the northern thinking, is not on linguistics but anti-linguistics. So how do you explain this anti-linguistics and integration perspective?
Good. This is an interesting paradoxical alliance. Integrationist linguists is largely a small group of white, largely male linguists who are anti-linguistics. They're anti-linguistic. They think language is a myth, that Western scholarship have created this myth of language. And you can see where our interests overlap with disinventing. For us, we were saying these languages needed to be disinvented and reconstituted. And they're coming in saying that language is a myth. And they come up and say that the expertise in language should be grounded and framed in the speakers of those languages and not in people who have got institutional support. So in other words, the expert in English, in Shona, is the speaker of Shona. So that is the other part. And they then also come up and say language is a third order category. Language is a mechanism for analyzing communication, right? And it's not the primary source of experience. So we find their free-flowing way of thinking very helpful, because they are able to provide some philosophical justification to arguments that we're making politically. So disinventing and its notion of language, when we align it with integrationism, it enables us to explain how is it that institutions can accord so much power to a myth, right? And then that's where integrationism comes in, to explain the emergence of language as a myth. And through the work of people like Andre Pablo, Roy Harris, etc. Right. When we started working on disinventing and subsequently with Alice on our work, we were not very much aware of work in integrationists. Integrationists were largely based at the University of Oxford, and there was a small clique of people. They talked to each other and they never. But I remember when I was doing my PhD in second language acquisition, and this now touches back to my problem with indigenous languages. And my supervisor was saying, is it possible that when I argue that these learners are not successful in acquiring, because I was studying how speakers of English are learning Shona, is because what I am regarding as an object of learning may just be a myth. That he says that possibly I couldn't write in my indigenous languages because it was just all an assemblage of something, right? That was really the problem that was there. And you can see when you look back why that is something that has been interesting to me, that the language they were assigning to me was a language which I had no proficiency in.
Yeah.
It was an institutional judgment that had been made that I should know how to speak a particular language. So that was the issue about mother tongues in search of speakers. That was really the problem that was there, right? That the idea of mother tongues in search of speakers, that was the crisis of indigeneity for me, right? And so when you go like that, you then realize that mother tongues are myth, and you can frame it within integrationist linguistics. And the various volumes I have written, which touch on integrationism, they all are drawing on the politics of integrationism. For example, there's another series of volumes on language policy, language planning, in which we argue, does language policy or language planning need a construct of language in order to succeed? And the answer is yes. And that the construct of language that government provides may be completely inconsistent with the construct of language as understood and used by ordinary users. Yeah.
Yeah. And how does this kind of linguistics, you call it integrational linguistics, can actually help decolonize linguistics in the global south, because it is more informed by formal linguistics or even applied linguistics, which is very much influenced by this colonial tendencies?
No, it does, because the central argument in integrationism is that the centerpiece of expertise in linguistics is the speaker. The person who speaks that language is the one who has got expertise in that language, right? So it's not like the language teacher, it's not like the linguist, it's whoever is the user of that language is the expert in that language. So once you do that, then all aspects about lexicography, etc., grammar books, you have to be rewritten, because the experiences that are important for you are the experience of whoever is speaking that language, is the expert in that particular language. So if that person says, this is not a language, and so on says it's a language, then so it shall be. Right.
So as said, it does actually question the standardization.
Yes. It then begins to argue for a sociolinguistics in which there's no language standardization. For standardization, to some extent, whatever you are doing is you are removing the speakers from making the key judgments about what they are doing. Yeah. Right. So it is a sociolinguistics without standardization. Yeah.
So this is the last question now. What suggestions do you propose for the applied linguist in the global south to rethink or to do applied linguistics in their particular ecological context?
Good. This is an interesting argument. This is my view about it. We should not frame the applied linguistics that we do as being relevant to the context that we are working in only. We should seek to establish alliances with other different global souths, one. And two, we should use whatever networks we build to make our cases to the global north as well. In other words, it's our responsibility to shift their way of thinking about their own context, right? In other words, I have no doubt that the scholarship you do is relevant to Pakistan. I have no doubt the scholarship that Pasiantia does is relevant to South Africa and Nigeria. I have no doubt about it. That I take for granted. I have no doubt that connections can be made between the two of you. The argument that, however, needs to be made is the argument that I began by making at the beginning of this conversation, that the global south, the global north, is moving in terms of, the global north, in terms of intellectual orientation, is moving towards where we are. We don't need to catch up with them.
Yeah.
They're the ones who are moving towards where we are. Right. That is the issue, that's the argument I'm making. That is the other way around. That one doesn't need to get too much worried about all catching up with this, etc. It's them who need to catch up with where we are. Right. Because we creolized speakers, epistemologically creolized scholars. You know a lot about Pakistan, you know a lot about North American and European applied linguistics, and you combine the two and you produce a unique breed of scholarship. I know a lot about African scholarship, I know a lot about North American and British scholarship, and I produce all that. And when I combine that, that makes a unique brand of scholar. And they can produce that without us.
Yeah.
They can produce people who are experts in North American scholarship, but they can't produce somebody who is both a scholar in North American scholarship and African scholarship without us. Yeah. Right. That is the argument to make. And then the second follow-up argument to make is that the current impasse they are faced with, they can't resolve it by more replication, by more experiments, by what, but by a radical reorientation towards the nature of the problem that they are faced with, because their past is no guide to how they can resolve future problems. Yeah.
So in such case, definitely we need some policy changes, because in some countries the curriculum and all of this is determined by the government. Teachers are really following that. Yes, we need some policy, and we need to be able to make these arguments quite forcefully to our various governments and everybody, scholars, that look here, it's us who should be detecting what we need to do. Thank you very much, Professor Sinfree. It was really wonderful.
Thank you very much for finding time to come. Thank you very much.